In the late 1960s, Northern California was not only haunted by a killer, it was haunted by a mind that wanted to be seen. A murderer struck young couples in isolated places, then reached past the crime scenes and into newspapers, police stations, and living rooms with letters, ciphers, and threats. He did not just want victims. He wanted an audience. He called himself Zodiac. He was linked to at least 5 murders in 1968 and 1969. And yet decades later, his identity remains officially unresolved. That is what makes this case so disturbing, not only that he killed, but that he taught an entire society how fear can spread without ever showing its face. California, 1968. On the surface, it was an era of movement, rebellion, youth, and possibility. But beneath that energy, there was another America taking shape. One built on widening distrust. Institutions were being questioned. Authority no longer felt absolute. People were learning that danger did not always arrive wearing the face they expected. In that atmosphere, the first known Zodiac attack did not look like the beginning of one of the most infamous mysteries in American criminal history. It looked, at first, like one more terrible act of violence in a quiet place. Yet that is often how history begins its darkest chapters, not with a grand announcement, but with something that seems isolated, almost containable, right before it becomes impossible to control. The first confirmed attack associated with the Zodiac case took place on December 20, 1968, near Benicia, California, when teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were shot near a remote lover's lane. Months later, on July 4, 1969, another young couple, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, was attacked in Vallejo. Mageau survived. That survival changed everything, because now investigators were no longer dealing only with a silent crime scene. They were dealing with a pattern beginning to emerge, and with a witness who could confirm that the violence was not random in the ordinary sense. Soon after, a man called police and appeared to claim responsibility not only for the second attack, but for the first as well. That phone call was one of the earliest signs that this killer did not merely want to escape. He wanted control over the narrative. That detail matters more than it first appears. Many killers hide behind secrecy because secrecy protects them. Zodiac seemed to understand something even more powerful. Attention could protect him too. If he could dominate headlines, confuse jurisdictions, and force the public to look where he wanted them to look, then fear itself would become his accomplice. That was the genius of his cruelty. He was not only attacking people, he was attacking the confidence of an entire region. He was teaching ordinary citizens that a peaceful road, a parked car, or even a normal summer evening could suddenly become part of a larger nightmare. And once people begin to feel that danger has no pattern they can trust, they start making mistakes. They become more vulnerable to panic, rumor, and manipulation. That is one of the deepest lessons inside this case. Fear does not need to be constant to be powerful. It only needs to feel possible. Then came the letters. In July 1969, newspapers in the Bay Area received nearly identical letters, each containing part of a cipher and each demanding publication. The writer claimed responsibility for the attacks and began constructing the persona that would make the case legendary. This was no longer simply a homicide investigation. It was becoming a psychological siege. The killer was now entering homes through print, weaponizing media attention long before the internet made such manipulation common. He understood spectacle. He understood timing. Most of all, he understood that once the public starts listening to a monster, the monster no longer needs to be physically present to keep harming people. The crimes were committed in minutes. The fear they generated could live for years. There is a reason the Zodiac case still grips people decades later. It is not only the unsolved identity, it is the terrible sophistication of the performance. The letters created a second crime scene in the public mind. They turned investigators into unwilling participants in a game, reporters into couriers, and readers into witnesses. This is how evil can evolve in a modern society, not just through violence, but through messaging, branding, and the exploitation of attention. That lesson remains painfully current. We like to believe danger looks chaotic, obvious, and easy to reject, but some forms of danger arrive organized, theatrical, and strangely intelligent. They do not simply break laws. They study people. They study systems. They study what a society is most afraid of becoming. And still, at this early stage, investigators did not yet know how large the shadow would grow. They had fragments of witness memory, scattered evidence, and a killer who seemed to gain confidence each time the public reacted. What began on dark roads was becoming something colder and far more difficult to contain. Because the most frightening possibility was no longer that a murderer was loose in Northern California. It was that he wanted to keep proving he was smarter than everyone chasing him. And in the next phase of the case, Zodiac would do something even more chilling. He would turn his crimes into a public identity that seemed impossible to erase. By the summer of 1969, the Zodiac case was no longer a quiet investigation buried in local police files. It had become something much more corrosive, a public obsession. The killer had found a way to extend the reach of his violence beyond the places where it happened. He was no longer just attacking individuals in secluded locations. He was invading the imagination of an entire region. Every new letter deepened that invasion. Every cipher fragment, every taunt, every threat transformed the case into a contest between law enforcement and a man who seemed to understand that fear grows fastest when people feel they're being watched by someone they cannot see. The letters did not merely claim responsibility. They were carefully designed to provoke. The writer wanted newspapers to print his words. He wanted police to respond. He wanted ordinary people to read about him over breakfast and on their way to work. He wanted his name, or rather the name he gave himself, to become part of daily life. That is one of the most unsettling truths in this case. Zodiac was not satisfied with secrecy. He wanted a stage. He was building an identity out of mystery. And every institution that tried to contain him was also, in some way, helping to spread him. Then the case took another turn. On September 27, 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked at Lake Berryessa. Unlike the earlier shootings, this assault carried a more theatrical quality. The killer approached in costume, speaking in a controlled, almost practical manner, as if he were acting out a role he had rehearsed in his mind. That detail has haunted investigators and historians for decades. It suggested not only violence, but performance. He was no longer just committing crimes. He was staging encounters. He wanted to impress something onto memory, to make survivors and witnesses carry his image long after he disappeared. And then came a detail so cold it still feels unreal. After the Lake Berryessa attack, the killer wrote dates and symbols on a victim's car door, linking the crime to previous attacks. It was the behavior of someone who did not fear being forgotten. On the contrary, he feared being misunderstood. He wanted authorship. He wanted police and public alike to know that these acts belonged to one hand. One voice. One invisible presence moving across Northern California. This is where the case becomes more than a hunt for a suspect. It becomes a study in ego, in control, in the terrifying human desire not just to do harm, but to be recognized for it. Only weeks later, on October 11, 1969, San Francisco cab driver Paul Stine was killed in Presidio Heights. This crime shattered the earlier pattern. Until then, the attacks had largely centered on young couples in relatively isolated areas. Now the setting was urban, exposed, almost audacious. The killer had moved from dark lovers' lanes into the heart of a major city. For many people, that was the moment the case changed from frightening to suffocating. If Zodiac could operate not only on quiet outskirts but in San Francisco itself, then the old comfort zones collapsed. The threat no longer belonged to remote places. It could enter everyday life. The investigation became more intense, but also more complicated. Multiple police departments were now entangled in overlapping facts, witness accounts, forensic questions, and jurisdictional boundaries. That is another hard lesson buried in this case. A dangerous offender does not need a supernatural advantage to evade capture. Sometimes confusion is enough, sometimes bureaucracy, fragmented communication, and the natural pressure of public panic create openings that a calculating mind can exploit. Zodiac seemed to understand that. He moved through those cracks with chilling confidence. The media attention only magnified the pressure. Each reported detail generated fresh leads, fresh theories, fresh fear. But attention is a double-edged force. It can help solve crimes by bringing forward witnesses and information. It can also flood investigators with noise, distort memory, and reward the offender with exactly the notoriety he craves. In the Zodiac case, that tension became almost unbearable. The public wanted answers. Police needed precision. The killer seemed to thrive in the space between those two demands. And beneath all of this was a painful human truth. The victims were not symbols. They were young people, loved people, ordinary people whose lives were pulled into a story they never chose. Families were left with grief, uncertainty, and the unbearable weight of never fully understanding why. That is why true crime, at its best, should never become a theater of cruelty. Cases like this matter because they force us to confront something uncomfortable about society itself. How easily attention can drift toward the offender while the lives damaged by that offender risk being reduced to background. By the end of this phase, the Zodiac Killer had achieved something few criminals ever do. He had not only evaded capture, he had altered public behavior. He had changed how people thought about strangers, roads, routines, and chance. He had turned fear into a social atmosphere. But the most disturbing part was still ahead. Because as investigators dug deeper, the case began producing what every unsolved mystery eventually breeds: suspects, contradictions, missed signals, and the terrifying possibility that the truth had come close more than once, only to slip away again. As the Zodiac investigation expanded, it entered the most dangerous phase any major case can reach, the point where information becomes both a weapon and a trap. There were more headlines, more tips, more theories, more names whispered with sudden certainty. But certainty is often the first illusion in an unsolved case. The deeper police went, the more they found themselves inside a maze built not only by the killer, but by the limits of the era itself. Different jurisdictions held different pieces. Witness statements were incomplete. Forensic science was far less advanced than what modern audiences are used to seeing. And hovering above all of it was a murderer who seemed to understand that confusion, if maintained long enough, can become its own shield. What made Zodiac so uniquely disturbing was not just the violence tied to him. It was his method of psychological expansion. He wrote letters not like a man trying to explain himself, but like someone trying to control the emotional weather of an entire region. He teased police. He threatened schoolchildren. He used symbols, ciphers, and theatrical language to turn his presence into something larger than one suspect profile. He was crafting a myth while investigators were trying to build a case. That imbalance matters. A case demands facts. A myth feeds on ambiguity. And once a killer becomes a myth, every silence starts to feel meaningful. Every coincidence begins to look like proof. And every unanswered question breeds another. Some of the Zodiac ciphers were cracked quickly, but others became part of the legend. One of them remained unsolved for decades before being deciphered by private citizens in 2020. Yet even that breakthrough did not reveal a clean ending. It did not suddenly produce a courtroom-ready identity or a final confession. Instead, it reminded the world of something frustrating and deeply human. Solving one puzzle does not always solve the case. People often imagine truth as a locked door with one key. In reality, truth in a case like Zodiac is more like a room filled with half-burned maps. You recover fragments, you compare them, you test them, but even then, the full shape may never return. Then came the suspects. Over the years, many names were put forward, and among them one name rose above the rest in popular imagination: Arthur Lee Allen. He has long been one of the most discussed suspects in the Zodiac case because several details seemed, on the surface, unnervingly suggestive. He had behavior and circumstances that drew police attention. Some people who knew him made statements that added to suspicion. And for the public, he fit something important: the emotional need for a face. This is one of the central tensions in all famous unsolved crimes. People do not only want answers because answers bring justice. They want answers because uncertainty is exhausting. A named suspect, even without definitive proof, can feel like relief. But relief is not the same as truth. Despite the attention around Allen, investigators never secured conclusive evidence sufficient to prove he was Zodiac. Fingerprints, handwriting comparisons, witness descriptions, and later DNA discussions all generated debate rather than closure. That should make us pause. Because one of the most dangerous habits in both public discourse and criminal investigation is the desire to force a story into completion before it has earned that ending. When fear is high and mystery is prolonged, people begin filling gaps with emotion. They start confusing likelihood with certainty, suspicion with resolution, narrative with proof. This is how wrongful conclusions grow. It is also how real offenders can slip away while the spotlight burns too brightly on one imperfect answer. And that is what makes the Zodiac case so intellectually and morally unsettling. It is not just a mystery about who committed certain crimes. It is a case about how a society reacts when it cannot get the certainty it craves. The police were under extraordinary pressure. The public wanted immediate reassurance. The press needed new angles. Amateur investigators generated endless theories. All of that produced momentum, but not necessarily clarity. The modern viewer should take that lesson seriously. In real life, the need to know can become so intense that it starts distorting how we evaluate evidence, credibility, and doubt. There is also a quieter tragedy beneath the mythology. Every year the mystery endured. The victims' families carried not only grief, but incompletion. No clean verdict, no final courtroom moment, no official end strong enough to silence speculation. That kind of uncertainty changes the shape of mourning. It leaves people not only with absence, but with interruption. A life was taken, and even the truth was taken with it. Society often focuses on the brilliance of the mystery. But for families, there is nothing glamorous about an unsolved case. There is only a wound that never receives a final answer. By now, the Zodiac story had become more than an investigation. It had become a mirror reflecting fear, obsession, ego, and the limits of justice itself. Yet the deepest question still remained untouched. Even if the name were known, would that fully explain the terror he created? Or had Zodiac already shown something more disturbing than identity alone? That a person can turn media, panic, and uncertainty into a weapon so powerful that it survives long after the crimes themselves? In the final part, the case stops being only about who Zodiac was and becomes something even heavier, what his legacy reveals about society, memory, and the kinds of danger people fail to recognize until it is already too late. By the final stage of the Zodiac story, the case had already crossed a line few criminal investigations ever cross. It was no longer only a search for a killer. It had become a struggle over memory itself. The murders were terrible. The letters were disturbing. The ciphers were infamous. But the deepest damage went even further than that. Zodiac proved that a criminal could leave behind not just victims, but an atmosphere. He created a lingering condition of fear, one that outlived the attacks and settled into culture, conversation, and collective imagination. That is why this case still feels alive. Not because the violence continues, but because the uncertainty never fully ended. In one sense, the public keeps returning to Zodiac for the most familiar reason. The name was never officially closed with complete legal certainty. People are drawn to unfinished stories. The human mind dislikes open loops. It wants a final face, a final motive, a final moment where confusion hardens into truth. But the Zodiac case resists that desire. It offers fragments, patterns, signals, and possible suspects. Yet it withholds the one thing people want most: closure strong enough to silence doubt. And in that refusal, it teaches something uncomfortable. Justice is not always neat. Truth is not always recoverable in perfect form. Some cases end in court. Others end in archives, theories, and generations of people still asking the same question. That is part of what makes Zodiac so educational in a way many crime stories are not. This case forces us to confront how vulnerable society becomes when fear combines with spectacle. Zodiac understood that violence alone would make him dangerous, but violence plus communication would make him unforgettable. He exploited the weaknesses of systems that were not built for a criminal who wanted publicity as much as secrecy. He moved through the gaps between jurisdictions. He exploited media hunger. He fed on uncertainty. In the modern world, that lesson matters even more. We live in an age where attention spreads faster, myths grow quicker, and public panic can travel farther than facts. The Zodiac case now feels almost prophetic. It showed, decades early, how easily terror can be amplified when the offender knows how to manipulate not only people, but information. There is another lesson here. quieter but just as important. Many dangers do not appear extraordinary at first. A familiar road, a routine stop, a harmless-looking interaction, a letter that seems bizarre before it seems threatening. Human beings are not naturally good at recognizing risk when risk arrives in pieces. We tend to trust patterns that make us feel safe. We assume danger will announce itself clearly. We believe that what is ordinary must also be harmless. Cases like Zodiac expose that weakness. They remind us that awareness is not paranoia. Caution is not cowardice. Paying attention to unusual behavior, patterns, threats, and inconsistencies can matter more than people realize in the moment. But the story should not end with the killer's mystique. That is a trap many famous cases fall into. The more mysterious the offender becomes, the easier it is for the world to orbit his image and forget the human cost left behind. The real center of this case is not the symbol, not the letters, not the mythology. It is the lives interrupted and the families forced to live in the long shadow of uncertainty. It is the investigators who spent years chasing fragments. It is the communities that learned how quickly normal life can be poisoned by unseen threat. And it is the public lesson that evil does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives methodical, patient, and painfully aware of how to use a society against itself. That may be the most unsettling truth of all. Zodiac did not need to overpower an entire state physically. He only needed to convince people that he could be anywhere. That he might strike again. That he was always one step ahead. Once that belief took hold, fear began doing part of the work for him. That is how manipulation functions at its darkest level. It turns imagination into a battlefield. It makes people carry the threat even when the threat is not physically present. And once a society begins living under that shadow, the criminal has achieved something beyond the immediate crime. He has altered behavior, trust, and memory. Even now, after decades of books, documentaries, suspects, and renewed analysis, the Zodiac case remains a warning disguised as a mystery. It warns us about the seduction of spectacle. It warns us about the danger of premature certainty. It warns us that when media attention, institutional limitation, and public fear collide, truth can become harder to reach, not easier. And it reminds us that the most chilling crimes are sometimes not the ones with the most brutality, but the ones that expose how fragile our sense of safety really is. Because in the end, the Zodiac Killer may remain officially unnamed, but the real horror was never only that one man escaped identification. It was that he revealed how easily modern life can be infiltrated by a stranger who understands fear better than the people trying to stop him. Some killers leave a crime scene. Zodiac left a question that never stopped echoing. And perhaps that is why his shadow still feels so cold, because the case does not simply ask who he was. It asks how close danger can stand to ordinary life before anyone truly sees it.